All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Building Lasting Growth in the Digital Era. This is a webinar that's inspired by a recent report commissioned by the Walter and Evelyn Haas Jr. Fund called Lightning in a Bottle, Building Lasting Growth from Viral Moments. We're going to hear more about that report, and then we're going to jump off from it and talk more broadly about what it looks like to integrate mobilization, fundraising, engagement, and what that looks like in today's movement eras. And I'm so glad, actually giddy, frankly, to get the chance to be in dialogue with these three women in a few minutes. And I know it's something that you're all looking forward to too. What you see on the screen at the bottom right, every action, I want to lift them up because this webinar is complimentary because they've so generously sponsored it. And it's perfect because every action is a platform that helps nonprofits span fundraising, digital marketing, organizing, and advocacy. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about today behind the scenes is that kind of technology. So you can look at everyaction.com if you're in the market for such a thing, and we appreciate them very much. Let's look at the logistics for today. This is a 90-minute session to give us plenty of time with our panelists, and it will be recorded. It is being recorded. There are a number of follow-up materials we're going to send you. If you haven't read the Lightning in a Bottle report yet, we'll certainly include that link. There's also a very helpful sort of tear sheet from it called Putting It Into Practice, a separate document PDF that we're going to send you to share with your staff and board. I know that Chanel's going to reference some materials during this session, so there'll be any number of goodies that are going to be packed up in that follow-up email in several days after today. We're going to use the Q&A box entirely for the discussion with you, so feel free to write your comments and questions in there. The chat is disabled for participants. You can upvote each other's questions, etc., and that should be a lively space. We always complete with an evaluation, so as the session closes, please just take a minute and a half to let us know what you thought and give us your feedback for the future. All right, so let's get into meeting our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here and for co-designing this session. And let me hand it to you, Adela, to start us off.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Adela de la Torre, she, her, hers, currently the Deputy Director at Justice Action Center, formerly the Communications Director for National Immigration Law Center, and one of the authors of Lightning in a Bottle, along with Robert Bray, Marjorie Fine, and Rachel Baker.
Great. Chanel?
Thanks, Jean. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. I'm Chanel Matthews. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Brooklyn, but I'm calling in today from my hometown in Los Angeles, where I'm preparing to celebrate my grandma Trudy's 75th birthday. So excited to do that. I'm so glad that you all showed up today. I serve my community in three key ways. I help individuals and organizations and coalitions and campaigns frame complex issues for everyday people. And right now I serve as the comms director for the Movement for Black Lives, which is an ecosystem of 150 organizations working to build Black political power. I also invest in the field of strategic communications and narrative power by building infrastructure to connect people who do social change communications with resources and to one another. So in 2016, I founded the Radical Communicators Network, or RADCOMS, which is a community of practice for social change communicators. And I also teach critical theory and social justice with an emphasis in Black resistance at the New School.
Thank you so much for being here. Tiffany, welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to join you today. My name is Tiffany Luckett. I use she or they pronouns as you're comfortable. My current role is Senior Officer and Co-Director, Senior Officer for Individual Giving and Co-Director of Development at the National Immigration Law Center. And I live in Los Angeles. I work in my living room. It is a joy to be with you, and I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Thank you so much. We are all calling in from rooms of various sorts, right? Thank you all so much. Let's do a poll now, Anya, and find out who all's in the room so far with us. We know that you all play multiple roles. I know I play any number of roles in this and others too, but do you identify today as working in a nonprofit, as a nonprofit board member, as a personal donor to social justice groups, as an activist, as a funder, as a consultant or capacity builder? Let us know which roles you're in today. Interesting. So we have a lot of people identifying it a nonprofit staff role, but a lot of other things too. So we're certainly going to be sharing experiences as people that, as these folks design and manage programs. But I know for myself, having been steeped in this report and interviewing these three amazing people, as well as a number of other people for a feature that Nonprofit Quarterly did inspired by this report, I became a much more empathetic donor and volunteer as well. It gets you excited to understand all that goes into mobilizing us, educating us, keeping us retained, if you will, in these various efforts. So I love seeing that we're here with multiple roles. And I think this information is important in all of those spaces, in our board spaces, our volunteer spaces, our donor spaces. So thanks for filling that out. So let's, as we jump into this, I want to ask, well, first, actually, let me share with you, based on our planning calls for this and all that's in the report, et cetera, these are some of the topics we know we're going to cover today, just so you know what's coming. We're certainly going to start with what continues to change, what is changing as these movements surge, as our engagement strategies get more sophisticated, we get smarter about this, we're still learning and failing forward, all of that. So we're going to ask the panel to kind of take the pulse of that. We're definitely going to talk about working with the media. We're going to talk about narrative change. Once we have a platform like this, how do we start to shift the way our issues and causes are framed? We're going to talk about mobilizing people in our constituency. We're going to talk about the culture of experimentation that this era literally mandates, it sounds like, if you're going to be successful in any of these efforts. And we're certainly going to talk about fundraising as well. So all of those topics are going to come up somewhat sequentially, but maybe not. We'll see how it goes. But just to know that that's what's coming, and feel free to put your thoughts in the Q&A box, as we said. So Adela, let me ask you, since the report was the inspiration for having this larger conversation, to just tell us a little bit about why you wrote it, what you're lifting up, and maybe share a theme or two that you think is especially important. We know everyone's going to read it after this, but give us the lead author's hot take.
Yeah, well, no, it's this was definitely a labor of love for me. We first conceived of the report, the group of co-authors and I, sort of as a result of some discussions. Haas Junior Foundation, as folks may or may not know, has been a leader for a long time in investing in innovation and social justice. And we were really interested in this kind of the integration of mobilization, fundraising, and strategic communications, and how it builds stronger movements in a more sustainable fashion. And for this report, obviously, folks have seen a whole lot of headlines about big national movements doing that, like the Black Lives Matter movement. But one of the things that we were interested in is how this also works for smaller regional organizations. And so the report is really two case stories of two very different organizations that were able to use the momentum from different types of factors to build a new sustainable growth path. Mm-hmm. And I think the big take-home message for me is that it's not really actually about the lightning. It's about the bottle. It's about it's about building the systems and structures and the culture necessary to harness the energy and use it in the long term. I'll just end by saying it's a little bit of a love letter to communications and development folks, because I think obviously the programmatic work is super, super important. But I think without the integration of the entire body of a movement or a group of people, you're not going to actually be able to build that strong bottle.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And to say that Adela and Tiffany, you worked together at that time, right? At NILC, at the National Immigration Law Center. Adela, you've since moved on, right? Tell us where you are now.
Yeah, I'm currently at Justice Action Center, which is an organization that is deploying a new model to kind of incorporate storytelling with strategic litigation. So I'm really, really excited about it, but definitely absolutely miss working with Tiffany, where, you know, we would meet multiple times a week to go over data and to discuss kind of strategies and tactics and things like that.
Great. Well, we're going to hear more about that as this unfolds. And that's why thank you so much for being here, Tiffany. And we know that things have evolved, certainly, as you've continued to sustain and grow that base. So again, encourage you to have a look at that report. There's the website. It will be in the follow-up email, as well as our coverage of it and some other good materials for you. And it's our jumping off point to think about how incredibly, right, the tools and methods and practices of that intersection of engagement, mobilization, fundraising, long-term support, and activism have moved. Even, I would venture to say, and I want to hear first from Chanel on this, even in the last couple of years in the context of COVID, the murder of George Floyd, et cetera. So we keep sort of surging ahead. And I want to ask you, sorry, wrong slide. I want to ask you to start us off by talking about the context as a comms expert and a movement expert. How would you describe this situation right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad to be talking about this, and just to hear Adela's assessment about the bottle and the lightning is so affirming for me as a longtime communicator.
Mm-hmm.
We've been pushing the boulder up the hill to get people to codify communications into social movements. And although it's been around forever, although people maybe didn't call themselves communicators in the past, but I think of Ida B. Wells and Bayard Rustin and the people who have, for me, I live in their lineage, and I just want to, I think, remind us of that these social movements are protracted, right? They're long-term efforts, and we know that these lightning in a bottle moments are reflective of deep, long organizing strategies that build power over time and through generations. And you can't start a movement. When I worked at BLM, people would say, how did you guys do that? And I'm like, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, of organizers, activists, strategists who come before us, and we build on existing strategies. But there are two developments that I've been tracking around engagement, communications, and mobilization that I want to talk about, and these are very humble opinions. So first, this is my 10th year building narrative power for social movements, and I'll talk a little bit more about what narrative power is and how we deploy it. But in that time, the field of strategic communications has grown profoundly, and that's one significant change that we've seen. More and more institutions working to eliminate oppressive systems and build inclusive ones are coming to understand that stories and storytelling are the backbone of an inclusive society, and how they're told defines whose lives are valued and whose are not. And that narrative power shapes all other types of power, such as social power, economic power, and political power. And so the growth of this field is instrumental in defending democracy and building genuinely inclusive societies over time. And it's been the critical efforts of communicators and organizers, whether they call themselves that or not, whose work is rooted in understanding and centering the challenges and experiences and insight and wisdom and stories and knowledge of everyday people who are experiencing domination and exclusion, that have changed the hearts and minds of people, that have set political agendas, and that have transformed culture to create a more equitable society. And so in recent years, social change communicators who are deeply embedded in community-based struggles, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by grassroots framework later, they have used the power of culture work, of digital organizing, of journalism, of storytelling to combat the ascent of the far right, from women-driven movements in Argentina, to Poland, to Me Too here in the United States, and the movement for Black Lives. Issues rise and fall from the media all the time, but it's our job to maintain that existing drumbeat, and also to infuse a kind of radical assessment into strategic communications and power building. So growth in this field is incredibly instrumental to long-term power building efforts, and organizing those communicators toward a radical narrative framework is a big part of that shift. And it's a big part of the role that I play in movement. And I want to just tell you a little bit about the Radical Communicators Network, which I mentioned earlier. So this community of practice has over 5,000 members globally, and it's a good example of how we optimize the field and and opportunities for growth when we have opportunities for growth. So RadComs creates infrastructure that communicators need by facilitating collaboration between and across movements, by sharing and incubating strategies, by creating in-person and virtual events to build trust and relationships and community building, but also to leverage resources, democratize those resources, to share them, and to create more opportunities for people in the field who don't have access to significant resources because they work at firms and large institutions. What's different about RadComs, although I founded the network, is that it is completely decentralized. It's organic, it's driven by people in the field, and it's not tied to any individual organizational brand. This is incredibly important. We are not using market-based strategies for liberation. We believe that our job is to be a conduit for grassroots communicators to disseminate radical frameworks for strategic communications into more mainstream and academic spaces, and to train people up in narrative power strategies that democratize our field, that put people closest to oppression at the center of our efforts, as opposed to marketing or market-based strategies, which in many ways are antithetical to true freedom and liberation. We believe what sets us apart is that we don't sacrifice principles or ethics for strategy, but that the most important role that we can play is to build narrative power for social movements. So we organize an already connected group of people and change makers. And in the last year, we've seen that group grow significantly. So lots more people entering the field coming in, and which is why it's so important for us to take the time to offer political education, professional development, and also relationship building so that communicators coming in are doing it from a place of genuine and meaningful radical transformation, as opposed to kind of just tinkering around the edges. And then I want to name just one other quick development that I've been tracking from a narrative perspective is that the progressive sector is becoming more and more honest about the fact that we don't always agree about how change happens. We're ditching fake unity and homogenous strategies, which in my opinion is an excellent thing. So one example from last year, during the 2020 uprisings in the US and globally, defund the police permeated the streets, the airways, the halls of Congress, the digital spaces, and it transcended borders and regimes, languages, and culture. And it quickly became a rallying cry of the globally oppressed. Instances of police terror and the resulting uprisings gave us narrative strategists an opportunity to proliferate visionary messages and build narrative power for ideas and stories and policies that advance innovative approaches to community safety and peacekeeping. But when M4BL and our allies made the demand to defund the police, we were shamed and stigmatized on a national level by progressives, people who were really upset with us, you know, and they reached out to us like wagging their fingers, telling us all the ways that we were being divisive and unstrategic. And I just want to point to you that this happened when I was the comms director at Black Lives Matter. This happened to us. They said, "Why are you saying Black Lives Matter? Can't you just say Black Lives Matter too?" And it was just people being really afraid of a radical assertion that Black Lives Matter. They wanted us to kind of water it down in some ways. But it wasn't just people in nonprofits. Also, it was also the president, the incoming president, and the former president who were chastising us, right? And so people wanted to know why we couldn't say things like reimagine public safety, which, by the way, people are using that frame, or divest from policing. Why were we saying defund? The reason why this is important is that these ideas that we're espousing now are unpopular, but that's what tends to happen with civil rights work. They will be the norm in the future. And in the meantime, we'll be considered kind of provocateurs, but I want to point to something that maybe won't be reported on in kind of long form analyses of last year's power building opportunities, which is that we played a flanking role to the moderates and to the centrists who won kind of progressive-ish wins in 2020. So a positive radical flank effect can occur when the bargaining position of moderates is strengthened by the presence of more radical groups, i.e. us. And those radicals can provide a militant foil against which moderate strategies and demands are redefined and normalized. In other words, kind of made more reasonable. So it's kind of simple psychology. We offer constituents something wild and shocking to them, and kind of more pacified and reformist ideas become appealing. And this is why it's so important. So I'll talk later about the successes and challenges of defund as a demand and as a modern example of systems and belief change. But in terms of engagement, communications and mobilization for social movements, both the growth of the field and the emergence of different factions have made our ideas more potent and are allowing us to get to the root of the problems instead of tinkering around the edges of those problems.
Thank you so much. There was so much in there. And I think I love that point about a shift in stopping this idea that we all have to get on the same page about messages, that's what good communications is for an entire sector of society, as opposed to recognizing the role that these different voices play and the effect they have when we tell the truth, even on the center. The effect they have even on the center is what I hear you saying. Tiffany, I want to give you a chance to, if anything, I'm sure lots came up from that opening, but anything that you want to share about what you see kind of shifting, what's the big context that we're working in right now?
I actually think Chanel nailed so much of it that I can't really add anything that would be new or of value. She nailed it. I think like opening that Gadsden window makes all the difference for how this movement moves forward.
I'm sorry, opening what window?
I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. What's the word? Adela, you remember this word. I used Gadsden, but that's not the word. I'll find it and I'll get back to you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I just wanted to learn what you meant there. Yeah. You know what? Let's do another poll. I'm curious to hear how much people feel that change in their own work. We know that most people on this call work in the nonprofit space. And I'm just curious how your own approach to engagement and mobilization has changed even over the last 2 years as an organization, whether it's how centered it's become, the shifting strategies, your own recognition of a need for new strategy, however you might characterize that change. Is there no change, a bit of change, or all the way up to it's dramatically changing?
Jean, is it okay if I actually ask a question of Chanel? Is that
You bet. Yeah,
allowed?
for people to go for it.
One comment, one thing that sort of strikes me from what you just said is how much narrative and storytelling, especially when it's coming from just lots of different places, can actually change perceptions of what is possible on a public policy level. And I think it's actually maybe a different calculation than a lot of communicators have kind of come into as they're working in a nonprofit ecosystem, where normally, you come up with a communications plan to buttress whatever the policy goal is. And I'm wondering if you're sensing a shift between kind of narrative change and storytelling being subservient to a policy agenda, or the two working kind of in conjunction more.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that every policy we proliferate has a story. I look at a lot of historical examples of policies that have deeply impacted Black and Brown communities. For example, PRORA that was passed in 1992 by Bill Clinton, which completely decimated the social safety net and eliminated access to much needed cash assistance, food stamps, and housing for not just Black Americans, but all Americans. They really screwed us on that one. But the story was told over 7 decades. The story about Black women's sexual prowess, about people who don't want to work, people who are lazy, and by 7 different presidents. And put into the firmament this idea that I hear actually espoused in focus groups all the time, specifically by immigrants of color, which is so interesting about how messages travel over geography and how belief systems become codified in particular groups over time. But I would say that the impact of good policy is solid narrative strategy. The impact of bad policy is also solid narrative strategy. And we'll talk about narrative power. And my assessment is neutral, is value neutral, can be good or can be bad. And so when we introduced the Breathe Act last summer, an omnibus bill to divest from toxic systems like the police and to invest in systems that benefit Black communities. And people, are like, this isn't politically possible, is what they say to us. If we tried to advance goals that we thought that the average person or the status quo thought was politically possible, we would never win. And so we make our assessments based on what the radical shifts in policy and organizing and narrative and art and culture and resourcing that Black people need. And we develop our own policy, and we will spend, the next 30 years building public will for those ideas. And so to me, policy and narrative go hand in hand, and every good policy has behind it a good narrative strategy.
Thank you. I think, Anya, do you want to share those poll results real quick? Can people see those? Great. So there is quite a bit of change, literally, and dramatic change going on in how people in this call, at least, are thinking about and approaching their engagement and mobilization strategies. So this is very timely indeed. Adela, I want to shift over for a minute and talk about the role of the media. One of the things that was interesting in the case studies in your report is both of them, both the small grassroots organization and NILC, which is a national organization, but grew a lot coming off of this, excuse me, this movement moment. Media played a key role, and sometimes it was media that had been developed and you didn't even necessarily deploy in that moment yourselves, right? So I just want to hear you talk a little bit about how that partnership with media unfolds and how people on this call can prioritize that. What should they do?
Yeah, so this is an example of something that even in a time of a whole lot of change has really not changed. And that's the value of relationships, right? Like it's it is the long-term work of engaging with reporters, getting to know them, getting to know their beats, and recognizing that they're not going to pick up every pitch that you swing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad investment of your time to get to know those folks and understand what their interests are. And of thinking outside the box, right? I used to work for an immigration organization, but that didn't mean, but as we all know, an immigration issue is an everything issue. Immigrants are involved in healthcare. And so making sure that you're establishing relationships with a wide variety of reporters, I think, is a really critical thing for any organization to do. I also think that their English language media, I have expertise in English language media and Spanish language media, and I think the role that they play in the ecosystem to those audiences is really different. For English language media, just a quick example, the then media relations specialist, now current associate director of communications at National Immigration Law Center, Juan Gastelum, actually established a relationship with a reporter who, it just so happened, the day after Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, included the National Immigration Law Center in a list of like under the radar organizations that are gonna need support. We can't necessarily draw a straight line, but several hours after that article was published, the National Immigration Law Center's website crashed because there were so many donations. Now that's a relationship that Juan had been working on for months and didn't necessarily get articles every time. But that reporter knew who we were as a result of the long-term investment that Juan had made in kind of establishing that relationship. On the Spanish language side, and I think for Latinx audiences in particular, I think the role of the media changes a little bit because Spanish language media in particular is such an important messenger of what is accurate and what is necessary for their communities to know. And so it's both an important role in movement building, but it's also an important way for folks to connect and learn kind of actionable ways to keep themselves safe, especially in the era of Trump with immigrant communities. That was critical. And also how to empower themselves. So I'll pause there and kick it back to you.
Thank you for that. Chanel, I'm curious to hear how you're thinking about working with the media has or hasn't changed over the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, I have worked at organizations that were like 3 or 4 people, and I've also been now at, I've been at the Sierra Club, which was like 300 people. And so I think it really depends on the capacity and resources your organization has as well to be able to engage the media. I don't want to overlook that because at smaller organizations, you're both like the strategist and the implementer, and it becomes hard to fit it all in. And that's part of the reason also why we developed Radcoms is like we share press lists, we share Cision accounts, we like democratize information because like, I'm really glad that these platforms exist, but they're gouging people. I'm sorry to say, and they're so frustrating how many times they email me. Oh my goodness. And anyway, I'll save that. On a soapbox about how annoying that shit is, sorry. But anyway, so at M4Bell, we invest a lot of resources into relationship building with the media, including hiring talent who knows and understands how the media approaches issues that specifically impact Black communities. Like that's really important for us. We offer dedicated time to train up our spokespeople every single month, practice rigorously to deliver and develop and deliver their messages, not just to like regurgitate the stuff that the comms people write. And we do proactive pitching on our issues, but I think that I want to say, like, for anybody who's worked with marginal groups, you know that like working with the media is twofold. They're not an objective third party through which we simply tell our stories. Like, it's been my experience that we have to engage them, and we also have to educate them and hold them accountable for lack of representation, for biased reporting, for malintent. But the other thing is that the journalism landscape have shifted immensely, right? As like newspapers close, as corporations buy newspapers. If you guys get a chance, listen to Invisibilia's episode, The Chaos Machine. They cover how reporting in Stockton, California has shifted the political landscape while the kind of traditional paper is not being trusted by constituents. And, people are filling that role. Like it's really interesting. It's not just happening there. So I want to say like, for us, we have plenty of reporters who do value our work. Kat Stafford at AP, Erin Morrison at AP, Jamila King at Mother Jones. I could name a dozen reporters who have followed M4BL since the beginning, who have committed to telling our stories, who have done so. Danny McClain from The Nation, who have done so in incredible ways. They're the minority of reporters. Most folks we really have to work with. But what I will say is that M4BL over the last year has committed to that process. And now we've become the go-to people on issues that we are relevant for. Now, whether or not my spokespeople practice and are ready to actually go deliver the interviews, that's a whole other thing, but they are coming to us. And I just want to point to a report that I shared with Jean to share with you all later, which is this media reparations report from Free Press. And it basically outlines the history that the media institutions have played and continue to play in supporting and expanding oppressive systems, and the fact that they actually have to be accountable to that. So it's twofold. It's yes, we have to build relationships with them. There are plenty of excellent reporters, editors, bookers, and other media decision makers out there that we work with. And then there are a lot of folks that we have to really massage and do work with, and who actually can do harm to our issues in their kind of lazy and unrigorous reporting.
Yeah, I've been interviewing folks for the feature about the report. The onslaught of media in these moments and the great variety in their intentions or capacity to address the issue well is part of the pressure of these lightning moments. There's no doubt about that, even in higher capacity organizations, but certainly in lower capacity. So being thoughtful about what it is that you are, who and what you are going to respond to is some of the advice that we got in covering it. Tiffany, is there anything you want to add about how that continues to progress at NILC, your relationships with media and how you think about it?
I will just add a little bit, which is I think one of the things that's been one of our strengths in this shifting time is having a deep bench of SMEs that are also well trained for media, subject matter experts, because we are in the very fortunate position to have a staff large enough to be able to have really specialized knowledge in several different areas of our work specifically. And Adela did a tremendous job in making certain that the experts around the building, if you will, across the country who work with NILC were trained so that they could actually do that education when the calls came in, and take those calls and answer effectively in a way that also didn't run down the communication staff or the executive office, because that burnout is real. We field so many calls from media. And one, we want people to know that it's not just our executive director who has the expertise and the knowledge. And also because we really do feel like people, their respect for our work deepens when they realize how much expertise we hold and that it runs across the organization. So I think one of the biggest things for us was really to have media training for a lot of SMEs who could then really dig deep as necessary on something like DACA or access to benefits, et cetera.
I love that idea about building respect, sort of and beyond the face of the CEO, with all respect to them, that there's this sense of a team that knows why they're there and knows what the issues are. Can either of you share just briefly, so for those who haven't done this yet, what does that look like? If you're taking staff who aren't in an official comms role, is that what and training them up, what's sort of a baseline training of that? Is it a day-long training? What does it look like to do that in an organization? Just give us a taste of it.
I can jump in. So yes to everything Tiffany said. Really value leaders, and everybody is a leader. And we have to also just the danger of having a single spokesperson. We've seen evidence of this. Things happen, right? People are held accountable for various things. Having a single spokesperson can bottleneck power, can create a lot of drama inside of an organization or an ecosystem. And so an ecosystem is such an important thing. I think that's what we're talking about here, right? The ways in which we all work together to interdependently to create lasting change. So for M4BL, we do two things. One, Chris Yankee, who is she passed last year, but she's a speech coach who taught me everything I know about media training. She wrote a book called The Well-Spoken Woman and a second book called The Well-Spoken Woman Speaks Out. I highly recommend both of them for anybody who's coming into learning how to be a spokesperson, because this is really about confidence. Nobody tells our people like they deserve to be in front of a group. You deserve to share your messages through the media. You deserve to represent your community and your organization.
And to be heard.
To be heard. And I will say this, like, white men that I work with feel very entitled to hold those spaces, but like women of color or trans people or people with disabilities or cash poor people often feel like less seen, because they're, we're often less represented. So what we do at M4BL is we do monthly media trainings where I'll have a 2-hour session every second Tuesday from 1 to 3, and they know, and I let them know in advance the full year of a training schedule so that they can make time in their calendar. And I give them here's what news is, here's who journalists are. Here's how to develop a persuasive message. Here's the art and the science of it. And we practice, we write our messaging and then we practice, because it fortifies them in the practice. There's nothing like practice. It is so humbling. It's one of my favorite things to do because it's so humbling for people. Everybody thinks they know how to do it until they get up to do it. And then everybody's like, wow, this is harder than I thought. I'm like, yes, go home and practice. So we set up dedicated practice time. And then the other thing I do is I run a cohort each year through a program called Channel Black, where we'll train up a specific group of people. So 1 year it was Black, single, low-income mothers who had either lost their children to state violence or had experienced some significant impact. So when we talk about centering the most marginalized, that's what we mean. We mean equipping these moms whose kids have been killed or significantly harmed by the state to talk about their experiences. And, just one thing, just leave you with, that was so profound for me, that one of the moms said was like, I really want to learn how to defend my son because everybody says that because he was in a gang, he deserved to die. And I just want to point to the rigor that these speakers have to be able to contend with some of the dominant narratives against our communities, to upend those narratives. And so it's tailored, it's specific, it's culturally competent, it's emotionally intelligent training. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And those things are so incredibly important to media training and spokesperson training, because a Muslim woman wearing hijab is going to have a different experience going to be a spokesperson than somebody who's not, for example. And she needs that kind of specialized, tailored support so that she can feel confident representing her community, her organization, or her movement.
I'm just really glad we've spent time here because, again, I think that the media plays a critical role, but I'm not sure that all groups understand how much goes in to, even for small and mid-sized groups, to doing this well, and also to extending or democratizing that spokesperson role across the organization and the volunteers. So thank you for putting a little more texture to that for those who might be newer to what that investment is, but it is part of building lasting growth. Having a single spokesperson, as you just outlined, sounds like not part of building lasting growth. By definition, really, it's like sort of a fractal, right? If we can't do it in our organizations, how do we get it out into the community? Let's move. There's a number of things that have come up there that I hear you in the Q&A, and I'm going to save some of those for our Q&A section. I want to be able to touch on each of these topics, maybe a little shorter than we have in our run of show. But Chanel, can you share a little bit about what you mean around narrative change, specifically thinking about whatever you want to share, but also knowing that our audience is thinking about, okay, I have this issue or cause or movement that I'm a staff person trying to support. What opportunity do I have with the narrative shift or change framework? What should I be thinking about?
Yeah, I want to first say that I think that the conversation around narrative has been very contrived, that narratives are a set of ideas or beliefs that have been refined over time that accumulate. And so when we talk about shifting the narrative, I think that it makes it sound like it happens one organization or one individual at a time, when really it happens with all of us in community with each other. And so I'll be as brief as possible. So every issue, every campaign, every policy that organizations spread, as we talked about, comes with a built-in story, right? These are complete with characters whose values are in some way threatened, a moral dilemma, a solution rooted in our vision of society and our worldview, and a call to action that helps us imagine or to create something new or something different. Mm-hmm. And so each of those stories has a narrative genealogy. That's the oral, written, or otherwise known account or record of the central values, ideas, and beliefs or motivations from which those narratives have evolved. And so our society possesses this structure of interconnected parts and subsystems that influence each other in really systematic ways. And within that structure, stories and narratives are the glue that holds those parts together. So given this, we're not just trying to change narratives, right? As we talk about it kind of capriciously sometimes, but we're trying to build narrative power. And power is such an important part of this conversation. A narrative power is a type of power that shapes the norms and the rules by which our societies live. And we know that powerful and wealthy operatives use institutions like commercial media and social media and organized religion, which come complete with predetermined biases, right, to propagandize and shape the often unspoken and pervasive norms and beliefs and values of a society. And so this serves to maintain a particular social order. And it's so important to just like zoom out a little bit and remember that like these narrative strategies preserve a social order in which white people and white Western ideas are rendered supreme. And in this paradigm, whiteness subordinates Blackness, capitalism is central to our existence, and the land is subservient to humans. And these norms and beliefs and values are then codified into society through legislation and regulated and controlled through policing and social stigma. So, unlike traditional marketing for good strategies, when we build narrative power for social justice, it requires the use of counter narratives. And this is one of the strategies that I really want us to consider in developing our narrative shift goals, right? Counter narratives are narratives that are derived from the most marginalized individuals and communities. And these narratives use their insight, their wisdom, their knowledge, their know-how to be able to build a more inclusive vision of society and to reimagine our existence and expand the dimensions of what we consider normal or acceptable. And in this way, we replace dominant narratives with diverse and inclusive stories. Narrative power necessitates that we not only center the experiences of the people in closest proximity to oppression, but that we also work towards models whereby those who are most impacted are part of leading, identifying solutions, setting priorities, creating policy agendas, and shifting narratives about human value. And so when we disrupt kind of narratives, that existing narratives, one of the things we have to remember is that stories are never told separate from larger power structures, right? That narrative is really a key element of the mode of production in which these elements that we're talking about really function. And so one thing that we, do at the Movement for Black Lives is we think about whose stories have been left off the table. When we talk about increasing representation for spokespeople, why that matters is because the stories that we're telling actually help us to see. And by see, I mean perceive of, understand, and be immersed in a different way of living and non-homogeneously, because history books, the media, right? Those are often tell us homogenous stories. And we're seeing a huge attack on critical race theory right now. Why wouldn't anybody want to know more about widening conclusion about whose experiences and stories have fomented our democracy? In part, they're trying to stifle that because they would like for the homogenous ways in which power currently exists to continue to exist. So narrative shift, again, doesn't happen one organization or one individual at a time. And there are these kind of pre-assembled archetypes that govern human lives. And that, coupled with kind of state repression, really impacts how people are able to galvanize and mobilize. But our job is to expose those narrative genealogies, those old antiquated stories that lead people to oppress others and to build a new vision of society.
There's a module right there. There's a module that people can share the recording as you're thinking about a more radical communication strategy and how you actually engage people over the long haul and those counter narratives. There's, as much as anything needs a counter narrative, it's immigration policy in the US. And I'm curious, Tiffany and Adela, if you want to comment on this too. I know that part of your journey that's captured in the case study is this evolution from an organization that was primarily talking to people who knew about immigration policy, right? The National Immigration Law Center had more of an inside field, if I read your case study right, sort of audience that didn't need to explain the history of those narratives or engage people, or wasn't engaging people as much in counter narrative building. I wonder how that's shifted as you've broadened out to this much larger mailing list, donor base, media platform. Whoever would like to start.
Tiffany, I think that's all you.
Thanks, Adela. we necessarily had to shift the way we were talking. NOC had always been known as a technical expert, and we provided technical assistance and technical expertise, and really had created a space for ourselves that made us a reliable, consistent voice on the details of the policy and of the law. And when we gained this enormous audience, we realized that it was room for widening the Overton window, which is what I was trying to say earlier, because we had started to recognize right before the previous administration, we had started to recognize that we were losing the battle on storytelling. We were losing the battle on narrative because there were a tremendous number of people, a stunning number of people, who could simultaneously hold the thought that immigrants were lazy and also taking all of the jobs, which is an odd juxtaposition of facts. And when we as you start to recognize that misconceptions and othering is running the storyline, you necessarily, if you want to stay in the fight, it's not about staying relevant, it's about staying effective. Then you have to start figuring out, how do you pull the window in your direction? And that really just required us to start thinking about, how do we talk to our supporters in a way that isn't, it's not like condescending. We're not trying to dumb down the information, but as Chanel was talking about earlier, making complex ideas really approachable for everyday people. And we still work on that messaging, right? We still have the old bones of, policy talk, but we are continuing to build on, based on what our folks are responding to and the way that people are responding to our surveys, we're starting to get a handle on recognizing what people need to hear to understand what changes in DACA actually mean, not from the back end of technical stuff and the law, but how does it affect multi-status families, right? Mixed status families. And so I think we've done a lot of surveying, really, and then we've done a lot of technical tracking to see what are the things that people actually pick up on when we send out these messages. Beyond understanding how, which subject line gets the most opens, what are the messages that people respond to the best, and what kind of tone are we taking? I think it's less about whose name appears in the front line and a lot more about, how does our tone show up for people? And do people see themselves in the stories that we're sharing? Do people see themselves in the outcomes that we're producing and the impact that we're hoping to accomplish? And that, I think, has helped us really to sustain the list of supporters, because they want to be able to talk to people that they know about this in a way that's approachable. They want to feel like, I heard this story somewhere and I can share it in a way that is useful and approachable.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stay with you, if you don't mind, Tiffany. Thank you for that. And shift to this idea of mobilization. So I know there's a quote from your executive director in the report about, we didn't want to just grow our numbers. We wanted to grow engagement. We want people who are going to be active participants in the fight. And so I'd like to even just hear how you define mobilization. Is that what you call it? And how do you think about objectives in that area as an organization?
Sure. I really talk about it as movement building internally for us, because at the beginning of the story, someone either incepts with NOC, comes into our orbit by either making a gift or taking an action. Mostly, those are the ways that people kind of come into contact with us. Sometimes they're just reading along, on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. But once we actually have an attachment to them, it's usually because they've, called Congress, or they got upset about something and they said, find me an immigration group. Here's my rage gift. Do something good with it.
Did you say rage gift?
Yeah. Okay, rage giving, that was that lightning. For us anyway, that morning that people walked into the office and were like, why won't the computer stop dinging? Because the gifts keep coming. and IT was like, no, the computers are working fine. But I think what we decided to do was to focus on the fact that nobody who comes into contact with us has to be only a donor or only an activist. Mm-hmm. And if you can get somebody to take action and get them invested in the mission and the work and knowing that they can actually be a meaningful partner in the work that needs to be done, the gift is really like sort of secondary to them. Like, oh yeah, of course I would make a gift, right? I'm invested in this work, and my gift of X dollars, it doesn't have to be a big gift, right? Is just like sort of a natural outcropping of the fact that I'm connected to this movement now and I want to sustain it, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that from my own experience as a volunteer with other organizations. The more deeply they get me dug into the work, the more natural it seems that if somebody would ask me to support it, why wouldn't I, right? Mm-hmm. And then the flip side is also true. I think if someone's willing to take their hard-earned dollars and put it toward this movement that they believe in and that they understand, then asking them to say, could you click this button to call your congressperson and ask them to vote yes on this confirmation vote or whatever, because we try to make it very straightforward and not really complicated for people to do that, I think people are willing to. And so our goal is to make sure that we're cross-pollinating across development and communications and activism, because we look at our communications arm as partly like a mobilization arm to get people moving. And if we can get people to be both, then we've got commitment from people, and that's how we build a movement. The moment of sending in the gift when you're frustrated is one thing. The commitment to saying, I also can do some work here, knowing that it doesn't have to be a huge investment, I think is the biggest key for us in the mobilization work.
I mean, co-sign absolutely everything that Tiffany said. I mean, I think just sort of taking a step back and on the lessons learned, especially when Tiffany and I went through this kind of lightning moment. One thing that I found, and Tiffany, I don't know if you necessarily would agree or not, but I think there are a whole lot of people with expertise on fundraising, and there are a whole lot of people with expertise in communications. But when you hire a fundraising expert to do the movement building work that Tiffany was just describing, it can be really difficult because a lot of folks are just interested in maximizing the number of donors, right? Maximizing the number of dollars each month. And it doesn't matter if you're burning folks out and getting them to unsubscribe from your list, because you're just going to try to find more donors anyway. And that's really not what we're interested in, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say, absolutely, sometimes you find yourself in a lightning moment and you need some help, but trust your gut. And this is maybe the flip side of this piece of advice, but also don't make assumptions about what your audience wants to see or hear. When Milk grew tremendously, we did a whole lot of experimentation. We sort of had the benefit of not knowing what we didn't know. And so we did some things that were total flops that I thought were going to be a hit. And then we did some other things that were experimental at the time for us that allowed us to actually engage with this new audience and hear their voices as well. I mean, I think that's one big thing I learned that I think we might be touching on. So sorry if I'm getting ahead of the script, but all of the data that Tiffany was just talking about, not just the open rates, but inviting people to give their opinion, to speak directly with plaintiffs, to call Congress. Those are all ways in which you can keep people engaged and hear from them as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that helps us shape the movement in ways that are meaningful to the people who are, as Chanel said, like most proximate to the harm that's being caused. And I think one of the other things that I missed but want to make sure that I emphasize is that we also shared data. We had a database system that integrated together, so it wasn't like, well, that's Comms' job and we don't touch it, and not vice versa, right? I wasn't like, well, it's development thing, so I'm not worried about it. We shared information. We had shared systems that talked to each other. We've had to upgrade. Exponential growth makes for exponential needs, for which I'm grateful. Let me not complain. But I think having systems that were integrated and really talked to one another both interpersonal and data, was really, really crucial to making the movement building part work.
Thank you. And I appreciate you lifting up that trying to approach this intersection of mobilization and engagement through a primarily fundraising lens, if I heard you right, Adela, is pretty challenging and likely not going to happen, right? And so that's not to say that fundraising doesn't bring a lot to the table, but that we're talking about a much broader set of strategies, and that acquisition of donors is only one metric in a whole set of objectives, which we also recognize can be hard because, at least in my experience, until recently, comms was one of the last positions to be hired in a growing nonprofit. They would go development first. It's going to be really interesting to see if that changes. You said, if I heard you right at the very beginning, Chanel, you said that the sort of codifying of comms is a form of movement building, right? And maybe it actually is the precursor. We just didn't call it that, or people didn't identify that way. So I'm going to be really curious to see, and maybe it's already moving, if comms is not the last thing to be hired anymore, because this era just doesn't work for this. But let me bring you back, Chanel, because I want to talk about this culture of experimentation. This was a major theme in Adela's writing in the report. And when we all met, I know that you underscored that as well in your work. Chanel, how do you think about experimentation within a larger comms effort or comms strategy?
I love everything Adela and Tiffany offered around that. I think organizing and communications go hand in hand. You can't build narrative power without organizing, and you can't organize without building narrative power. So it's essential that we kind of break down the silos in those two things. Mm-hmm. I love this question about experimentation because it's central to how I approach building narrative power. I was first introduced to design thinking by my mentor, Sujatha J. Sudasan, who's a professor of management practice at the New School. And it was just the kind of intervention I needed to stop making years-long comms plans and instead practice an emergent approach to communication strategy. And so many of us are taught really to believe that we need elaborate strategies to succeed in building successful movements and campaigns. But what we really need is agility, humility, discernment, and strong relationships. And it's my experience and assessment that it's the soft skills coupled with rigor and consistency that win lasting change. Especially in like heightened movement moments. Agility is so important. So I'm moving from the assumption that we are using divergent methods to measure progress or success for social movement efforts. But as a student of movement building and narrative power, I explore growth and progress cycles across months, years, decades, and centuries, and through the prism of protest cycles. And so protest cycles are the cyclical rise and fall of social movement activity. And sociologist Sidney Tarot defines protest cycles as a phase of heightened conflict across the social system, with intensified interactions between challengers and authorities, which can end in reform, repression, and sometimes revolution. In other words, we're really looking and analyzing at how uprisings shape attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors over time. All of that is experimentation. Because the challenges that we face as narrative strategists are significant, right? Including that we are stigmatized for our ideas that really rail against the status quo of power, like the idea of abolishing patriarchy or defunding the police. And so to me, experimentation really exists in this era of curiosity. And I'm asking myself this question: how under complex infrastructure of state and political domination do stories get to be told, and how do new ideas and visions of accountability and transformation get to be born? And so just to look at one really quick example around the defund the police, I promise to come back to this as one experiment. Was it effective? It really depends on how you define effective, right? And this is why experimentation is so important. We have to try different things. But I would say yes, like it was. The use of social media, the uprisings, the 50-state call to defund brought mainstream attention to abolitionist arguments that the problems are institutional, that they're systemic, and that the only way to reduce harm is to take power and funding away from the police. So even if people were unhappy about it, what we learned is that they were still talking about it. Pundits, journalists, Congress people, academics, they were like, no, it doesn't mean this, it means this. And I'm like, that's exactly the point, was to give folks something to carry a broader message in, which the concept of defund did. And it did it in a couple of ways. One, people actually did defund police departments. And this isn't a new kind of argument, right? Like people have been divesting from policing for a long time, but it worked. It was effective in that way. We saw $840 million in direct cuts from US police departments and at least $160 million in investments in community service, right? So we're seeing shifts, and it doesn't happen overnight. Again, like people would say, oh, was Me Too successful? It looks like they've gone away from the media. I'm like, well, the media stopped covering it. It doesn't mean that organizers aren't still organizing or survivors aren't still demanding justice, right? The other thing is that if we look at like effectiveness and change in our experimentation, we can look at impacts in election trends, right? We saw that like in the elections, like the defund the police demand really illustrated how people felt about change. It helped people to decide how they were going to engage in the elections. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that we saw support rise for BLM. 86% of Biden supporters were favorable towards BLM, right? And so that's really illustrative of whether or not like our experiments are working. It's like looking at the polling data and making assessments and public opinion data, not tethering ourselves to that because it's only one way of measuring change and effectiveness, but it is a significant way. And then finally, another way of just looking at the success of this particular effort is looking at its impact on the Democratic Party. Yeah. And other political institutions, right? So it caused huge political agitation within the Democratic Party last election cycle. It set off a whole chain of events that are still unfolding. They're spending tons of money to figure out what the impact of our demand was on them. And in a post-election analysis, I mean, 60 contested congressional races in 2020 featured broadcast TV ads regarding defund the police. They spent $33 million. So like experimentation, right? What is success? I mean, you really have to determine it not based on the status quo determinants of success, but you have to look at what is meaningful change over time. How are we seeding doubt, right? So if we're not changing narratives overnight, perhaps we're seeding doubt in people's minds that the ideas that they believe are real, or that what is politically possible is actually politically possible, or what we've been told is possible is possible. And so I think kind of really in closing on that, I think it's like, the defund experiment is incredibly powerful. It's incendiary even, and it has permanence in public discourse that other similar demands such as divest, invest, or even reimagining public safety don't have. And so my assessment is that the demand strengthened the bargaining position of moderates and normalized their demands, and that we should keep using it because truly for narrative shifts to occur, social movements require constant adaptation, evolution, integration, co-creation, and experimentation to create conditions for new belief systems to emerge.
Thank you for using defund as an experiment. It reminds me of what you were saying earlier about the flank. And I'm curious, Adela and Tiffany, even if you look at the immigration space, does having something that strong out in the world, the defund the police message, is that helpful in a solidarity way to the messaging that you know what I mean? Like it in the same way it provides messaging flank. I'm wondering where there's such a strong demand out there and what you're asking for and how you're languaging it. Do you see what I mean? I'm curious your reaction to that, like how we have these multiple messages out in the world at once. We're at these intersectional movement moments, right? How do you think about that?
Tiffany, do you want to take that first, or?
I think you should start, and I'll fill in blanks if there's anything left.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I think it's a good question. I think one thing that, as I sort of reflect on, I've been doing immigration communications work for 14 years. But as I sort of reflect on the last 4 years, where there was just this intense focus on immigrants and immigrants as scapegoats, right? Really, that was, when Donald Trump went down the golden escalator or whatever he did, the first thing he did was denigrate people like my grandmother, right? And that was something that really led to an incredible backlash, but it was a backlash against a Trump narrative. And that Trump narrative took hold because there wasn't necessarily the robust investment in the narratives that Chanel was talking about. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that conversations like defunding the police, conversations about what an abolitionist movement looks like, also in the immigrant sector, right? And I think this is something that the Movement for Black Lives has already included in its platform, right? But when we're talking about divestment from especially the private prison industry, those contracts now at the federal level are all being housed by DHS. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we need to not just yes, and I guess is the answer to your question, Jean. I think we need to make sure that on the immigrants' rights side and in all of our social justice sector, we need to make sure that what we are doing is looking at all of the different messages that other movements are using and making sure that we are being as inclusive as possible. So I don't know if that's like a direct answer, but I'll turn it over to Tiffany to add to it.
Adela hit a lot of the points, and I think that the key thing for us is that we have really started to recognize that our narrative strategy has to be intersectional, and we have to lift up all of these additional messages that are happening, right? Like, we recognize that immigration is a Black issue, and immigration is a labor issue, and immigration is an education issue, and it's a healthcare issue, et cetera, and we have to, in our ability to recognize those intersections and the fact that all facets of American life that affect people born in the States also affect people who were not born in the States but are here. And being able to have that broader umbrella look at things, I think helps us reinforce each other's messages. And we have always, I have felt, done a good job of trying to lift up other voices when we don't need to be the primary focus, even though this issue may affect immigrants, right? So the movement for Black Lives has an impact on Black immigrants, but we don't have to be at center stage there, and we can lift those voices up, lift those stories with our partner organizations. And I think that has been helpful in helping other people see that it breaks down the walls of these various identities and helps people understand that the intersecting harms, and that, like, remediating some stuff that isn't quote unquote immigration can still have a tremendous effect in improving the lives of immigrants.
And can I add one thing? Just
Please.
Can I affirm something that both Adela and Tiffany talked about, which is being good comrades to each other and not undercutting different movements' messaging. This is one principle of narrative power. So I have just a quick plug. I have an anthology coming out next year, Framing New Worlds, Resistance Narratives from 21st Century Social Movements, that covers the last 20 years of narrative power building, starting with the war on terror, all the way up to defund the police and everything in between. And one of the things that we include in there is a set of principles. And I think this is just so important for our field to commit to a set of principles by which we work, right? And one of those is that we don't undercut other movements' messaging in order to win short-term wins. We see this as a long-term power building effort. So I was at a rally for abortion rights, and the speaker said something to the effect of, if we give women access to abortions, they will no longer need, cash assistance or something like that. And it's patently false, right? Like, so, or even having to walk back old rhetoric. So just so important to just drive home this, like, being in community with each other, sharing messaging, making sure that we democratize access to the messages that we develop so that we can reinforce each other's messaging and not inadvertently harm each other's messaging opportunities or efforts.
I love that. I can't wait for that book. But these notion of principles that go beyond organizational values or even movement specific value, that feels very powerful. Tiffany, let's talk about fundraising for a second. You mentioned that day with the computer that was dinging and dinging and dinging in your lightning in a bottle moment. What I think we're most curious about in the time we have is, I think a lot of us read about these situations and think, and we donate to them too, whether they're rage gifts or we really do intend to stay in. How did you jump to this much larger donor base fairly quickly? But then what has been your approach to quote unquote retaining it? What have been some of the key strategies for NILC?
So I think there are several different tools that we have been deploying and experimenting with, actually, over the last several years. We didn't, until it was absolutely necessary, we didn't have a regular schedule of communication specifically for donors. And so we set up a system where, a donor might give in response to a specific moment, whether it's a great moment or a difficult moment. And we're trying to continue to follow up. What brought you here? What are you interested in? How do you want to be communicated with? Would you only want to hear from us once a month? Do you only want to hear from us once a quarter? Do you not want to hear from us at all? And then following up, a few weeks later, are you interested to become a monthly donor? With just a regular regimented schedule of conversation to engage donors when they come to us first as givers. Because we really do we want this to feel like a partnership for people who give or for people who take action, that we're all partners in making this work happen. And one of the things that we've had the opportunity to explore is using machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us understand who our donors are at various levels. So, for instance, if we have a donor that's giving $1,000 a year, who else who's not giving at that level but is already giving looks similar to that? Like, what's the lookalike model of who a donor is at one level or another? And then how can we communicate to them in a way that makes them engaged the way a $1,000 donor is, and will that help us upgrade their gift beyond where they've seen themselves giving? And we've also employed a researcher, which has been tremendous for our retention strategies, because we have expertise in house to understand modeling what does our donor base look like. Also, who's in that pool who has given a small gift but looks very unlike our small gift donors. Is that somebody who has the potential to be a major donor, but sent us that little test gift to see if we would handle it well, if we would be responsive to them, if we would engage them in future conversation, if we would try to keep up a relationship? And can we then be more personal with those people that we think are, like sneaking in the side door with a gift that they may be able to really expand? We've got donors who started off giving us $100 that we know could make six-figure gifts. And I'm less interested in getting the six-figure gift right now. I'm really interested in building the relationship that makes that gift come naturally.
So, of course, a couple people are very curious. Are you able to list or just share a little bit more about what kinds of tools fall in that category? Are these software?
Sure. Yeah. So we have been using a product called Boodle AI, Boodle AI. And that's an artificial intelligence company that helps us create these look-alike models. It's an investment and it's an experiment, right? Like, we're just looking at what do these two groups look like side by side, and then we're going to test. We're going to send out messaging that we think will be, responded to well. And if it fails, we're going to learn fast and change lanes. And we've been really trying to amplify peer-to-peer fundraising. We've seen a lot more interest in people just sort of wanting to just roll up their sleeves and say, here, I'm creating a Facebook fundraiser for the National Immigration Law Center for my birthday, or in response to this event. And, one of the things that's harder for us on that end is that because we are really relationship focused and we are less dollar focused, we really believe that building the relationships will make the money come. Facebook doesn't give us a lot of information about the people. So it's very hard to build relationships when, someone just says, oh, my cousin's birthday, I made a $20 gift. That is challenging for us. But if people really feel like that's the way they want to support us, we're not going to discourage it, because it still amplifies our message. It still helps other people learn about us. It's just that we don't get the chance to build relationships there, but we can't have it our way all the time. So we do the best we can with what we're given.
Appreciate that. Maybe we can use that as a jumping off point. It's just been implicit in everything we've talked about, but just how you're thinking about social media as both, let me put it this way. Chanel, I'm curious, when you think about social media now, how do you even describe it? Like, it's not in and of itself a strategy, right? It's a means to certain kinds of strategies. And I'm just curious, at this current moment, how do you, when you think about comms for Movement for Black Lives, how do you even articulate to your team and comrades how they should think about social media?
Yeah, if I'm being completely honest, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about social media because I have a digital staff who does that. And I am a late adopter to these to these tools. I'm not even on social media. What I do know is that whether it's traditional media, social media, or earned media, that media is the number one apparatus through which culture and ideology is shared and learned. And so it actually doesn't, to me, or, television, it doesn't, like, I did a focus group last year for Me Too, where I learned that the average person understands the way that sexual assault crimes are solved through Law and Order SVU. Like, that's where they get their information, right? And so, like, when we are contending with dominant narratives around sexual harm and violence, one of the things we do have to contend with is the ways in which media, whether it's social media or pop culture, have proliferated dominant narratives that undercut our organizing strategies, and we have to prepare for those. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we develop kind of narrative strategies not for social media. I mean, I spend a lot of time with my team thinking about that, and they take it and turn it into kind of bite-sized information. So M4BL has a huge social media presence. We have 500,000 followers on Instagram. We have 500,000 people on our email listserv, and Facebook, Twitter, all of that. And we do a couple things. One, we have tracks, right? So like our ecosystem is really vast. We cover issues from climate. We launched a Red, Black, and Green New Deal this year, to defund the police, to abolishing patriarchal violence, to TGNCI narrative power building. So every issue has its kind of own track, because one, organizers want to see themselves represented in their issues that they care about. People inside of our organizations and ecosystems have divergent goals, right? So like, our policy team wants to see our policy work really be amplified, and our organizing team really wants to see their work be amplified. So that's one thing. There's an internal, external strategy to social media. I think it's like making sure that there's a wide representation of the issues, but also like people talk about audience segmentation. I'm not going to lie, I get a little bit confused about how we actually do that on social media. It's similar to like, how candidates in purple districts communicate their issues. Like, what do you do when you have a base of Black people who are from different ethnic minorities, different religious affiliations, live in different geographical workplaces? I mean, there's just so many things to consider. So I think what I would say is like, it is the number one tool that we use to express our ideas. I don't know how it works all the time, but I do know that like what we do on the back end is we spend a lot of time developing specific narrative ideas for these different tools. What are we communicating about on email? What are we communicating about on social media? And that, to me, as you said, Jean, it is like a tactic or a tool to kind of advance a broader strategy that is connected to our earned media strategy and to our paid media strategy, but a strategy nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Adele, anything you want to add to that? Because I know that was something that you've talked about a lot in the report, and I'm sure you're using at Justice Action.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I agree with everything Chanel just said. I am also a late adopter and tech phobe in general. And I think one thing that's important to realize, especially even and maybe especially if your team is small, is digital strategy requires expertise. The folks that are hired to execute digital strategy have a really unique skill set that they employ. And so it's not really just a matter of like, oh, I've got my own Facebook page, I'm going to launch my own, like my organization Facebook page, and like it'll flourish. It takes a lot of learning. It takes a lot of experimentation. It takes a lot of work, frankly. And so making sure that you understand the investment of digital strategy, whether that's the investment that you're making yourself, or if you're able to have a team to invest in it. I also think that this is one place where I really learned in the case studies that what works in terms of digital strategy, it's a little bit what Chanel said, really, you've got to make sure that you're honing the narrative and the voice that feels authentic to your own organization. And that's what's really that foundation is needed. And then you kind of build the house of digital strategy on top of that, if that metaphor makes sense. Mm-hmm. With Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice, which is in the Riverside sort of inland region of California, they're a small, fiscally sponsored regional organization that has an outsized impact on the digital landscape. And a lot of it is because they use their own voice. They have lots of different voices, actually, that go into their social media channels, which is something that as a communications consultant, you might be like, oh, don't do that, right? Like have a unified voice. But it works for them. It's authentic to who they are. They also allow people to engage with them in a variety of different formats. So for their bail funds, for example, they use Venmo, they use text to give, they use a whole lot of different avenues. And I think that kind of like just super experimental and multi-voice strategy works perfectly for them and allows them to lean into their strengths as a regionally based organization. Now that strategy, I would venture to guess, likely would not work for a National Immigration Law Center. And so like really figuring out, as Chanel said, what your narrative is, what your voice is that feels authentic to you as an organization is kind of the key to developing a robust digital strategy.
Yeah, the Inland Coalition case study in your report is really inspiring, just in terms of how much power and narrative power a local regional group amassed in a fairly short period of time, but very narrative driven by constituency members, not about the organization, about constituency stories. This question is one that I think folks would like to hear you guys answer, which is how to balance stories versus what stories donors are interested in. And I know, Chanel, you've made it pretty clear that you're not too worried about that as you're working on these sort of macro level narratives. But this larger issue, I think this tension people perceive, or at least historically perceived, between letting fundraising drive the story choice or the story framing versus, and a lot of what you all have been talking about today. So how do you balance that at NILC?
Tiffany, do you want to answer that first, or?
Just talking about donor story versus the stories that donors want to hear versus the stories you want to tell, that kind of tension.
I can tackle that a little bit. And Tiffany, I'd love to get your take. But I mean, I guess what I would say is I would really interrogate that assumption on our own parts. I think when NILC first started growing, we did have that assumption, like, oh, and both the donor versus activist communication prong, and also, as Tiffany mentioned, NILC was it was a highly specialized policy wonk shop. And so we were like, oh, are people who care about employment rights going to care about the DREAM Act, right? And it turns out that people are people. They're multi-issue, they're multi-section, and donors also are people. Go figure. And so this is where really doing the research, Tiffany, and to sit down and see what works, what are people interested in, how are people engaging with your content, is what's going to guide you. And I'd say it's less intuitive than you think it is. And I don't know, Tiffany, if you've got some thoughts just based on kind of like, I know we spent a year of just like looking at data and doing a digital audit and stuff like that.
Yes, we did a lot of personnel investment in a digital audit and understanding the shapes and patterns of the way that people were interacting with us, whether they were donors or supporters or both. And I think one of the things that we really deeply internalized early on and remains true for us is somewhat counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of people in the sector, which is that our fundraising is, when we talk about digital fundraising, especially through email, we are more powerful fundraisers when we're telling stories than when we're asking for money. Mm-hmm. And our donors and our partners that are not giving yet love when we explain things and tell the story and what does this mean and what happens next. Mm-hmm. And we always include a passive button at the bottom. If you want to give, we're not asking you to give right now, but we're telling you the story. And if you want to give, you can give here. Mm-hmm. We find that people, when we're telling the right story and people are invested in whatever that topic is or the story that we're telling, people give. And then, except for those last 14 days of the year, typically when we send out an email, specifically requesting financial support, they don't perform as well as when we're just making certain to tell our story about the work. And I think I have seen a real shift in donor priorities. I used to always feel as though donors wanted to drive the strategy of what we were doing. And I now think that I see many more donors who are saying, What I mean by that is not at the grassroots level, but I saw in other lives of my fundraising career, big donors who were saying like, I want you to focus more on this or that. And thankfully, I've always been shielded from that by great executives who have said, no, we are going to stick to the mission and we're going to hopefully use your investment in that way. And if you don't want to invest in the mission, that's okay. But I have seen more and more that we are really working in a trust-based environment now. People actually believe that the folks on the ground know what they're doing, and that we will use their support effectively. And it's partly because I think we've gotten really good at identifying who out there loves what we're doing, rather than who out there can we convince to love what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's such a powerful thing you've just said. And I know those of us who are more sector-based, which isn't necessarily all of you, but have been asking for that trust for a long time. I actually wonder if that is not yet another ripple effect of the success of movements. That movement success has had finally an effect on philanthropy. Movement scale and engagement, because I don't know where else it came from, because people were asking for that for a long time. And I think there's something about that intersection of the movement surges and acceleration of the last few years that I think has shifted philanthropy and more towards this trust-based piece. It's an interesting intersection.
And I also think that community-centered fundraising, which is a fairly new concept to a lot of folks in philanthropy, has really started to gain some momentum, where people are starting to recognize, like, we don't have to center the donors' needs in everything that we do. The donors are very important, but we're actually here to serve the needs of the people that drive our mission. And, we are here in service of low-income immigrants and their rights. And we're going to center their needs, and hopefully the donors will get on board with that.
Mm-hmm. And that's the long haul too. And I've heard you both say that you're willing to lose some donors, right? I mean, that strategy means that they're not going to keep everybody. If people got there through a rage gift, right, or just through a quick thing, and they really aren't wanting to invest in that over the long haul, those experiments will weed them out, if I'm not mishearing you. And that's okay. If they're not really at this point in relationship with the organization, that experimentation will yield some of those losses. We have just about 3 minutes, and I'd love to give you each the option to just share something that you're taking away from this conversation, or more importantly, that you want to underscore for our listeners from what you think has mattered about this conversation. What kind of stands out to you? Who would like to go first?
I'll just say that I think it's just been tremendous to recognize how deeply anchored, as Chanel was talking about, like how deeply anchored change is in like constantly refining that narrative strategy, right? It's not about reinventing ourselves every time something shifts, but really recognizing that we have to be, we've got to build movements around constantly refining how we talk about this, and that it's totally fine to be radical, because doing that pulls the attention further in the direction that you want it to go. And if you can't imagine a completely different world, at least you can start thinking about what could look different. And until we get to abolishing the police, and until we get to abolishing the carceral state, the idea that someone would consider abolishing anything wasn't a thing we could talk about 2 years ago that we can talk about now. And it's just about being persistent in continuously refining your message.
Thank you.
This has been incredibly rich for me. I love hearing Adela and Tiffany talk, and you kind of give your analysis, Jean. And so I'm just really grateful for this time with you all. 3 things for me. One, we are working in service to building a more morally just and dignified world. That's the role that we play as movement makers, as nonprofit professionals. Even professional seems like such a weird word to throw into what we do, right? And I think it's just important to remember that we have to constantly be self-reflective about the ways in which we're bringing perhaps our own biases into this work, and that we can't transcend being kind of the best activist or advocate or organizer, that we have to constantly work on ourselves so that we're better for the movement, because we're not cogs in a machine. We're individuals with experiences and insights and information, but also biases and prejudices. And And so we need constant adaptation and reflection. I will say that's really important to me. And I have a practice where I do that. And I will say M4BL is really good at that too. The other thing is just one kind of tool that I would love for you all to think about as you develop your narrative strategies is a narrative power analysis, which was initially developed by Patrick Rinesborough and Doyle Canning and can be found in their book, which was called Smart Reimagining Change. Reimagining Change. And so one thing that this does is it gives us the tools to not really reverse engineer narratives, but to expose the genealogy and mechanics of those old entrenched narratives by asking a few questions. One, which stories define cultural norms? Where did those stories come from? Whose stories were ignored or erased to create those norms? And perhaps most urgently for us, what new stories can we tell to help create the world that we desire? And then lastly, I would just love for folks to think more radically about our communication strategies. Like, what's one kind of radical step you can take to democratizing your communication strategies in your organization toward a more morally just and inclusive society?
Thank you for that. Adela, lead author of Lightning in a Bottle, thank you so much for the work you did on that report. Is there anything you'd like to share in closing?
Just a tremendous amount of gratitude for the co-panelists and also for all of the folks who tuned in. I mean, I think, like I said, I wrote this as a little bit of a love letter to development and communications folks. And the fact that so many of you have chosen to spend your time to think about these issues and think about the intersection is really, really affirming to me as somebody who just wants to celebrate every single one of you who is trying to do this piece of the social justice work. So thanks to everyone. Thank you, Jean, and I'll hand it on back to you.
Thank you all so much. This has been so very informative and really inspiring, and I think mind frame shifting for me and hopefully for many of you. You are going to get a long list of resources thanks to these great panelists. So look out for the recording on Monday, as well as many of the resources as I could write down that were mentioned today, because there were a wealth of them. We appreciate all of the work that you three do in movement building, and thank you. And thank you all for being here. We'll see you next time.